May I take the reins?
Yeah, please. But may I acknowledge a couple people?
Please, go ahead.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you all so much for coming to see this movie. It really, I started to say it really means the world. The task that this movie is helping to serve is, well, I'll get started a little bit later on. But the first thing I want to do is to acknowledge the people who are primarily responsible for it, and they are actually here this evening, the directors of this movie, Bonnie Cohen and John Schenck, and I want to acknowledge them in back there. And they are, so I'm pretty biased, but they are awesome. And the producers of the movie are here. Diane Wireman from Participant and Richard Burge from Actual Films are both here. And the CEO of Participant Media, David Lindy, is here, and his wife, Felicia. And I want to thank Mayor Ted Winterer because we were together in Bonn. I don't know if you picked up on that part of it, but he represents Santa Monica so well. He's got some energy and vision left over to help the world, and he was over there with a group of mayors helping to do this. And Dan, thank you for your work, and I'm sorry to take that time, but I really wanted to do that.
By all means. I have just three quick housekeeping items before we get started. The first is a disclaimer, which is that I work for NRDC, and we are a longtime partner of Participant Media. We help promote this film and its predecessor to our base. Just wanted to put that out there. The second thing is that audience members submitted questions before the film online. I read those questions, and I've selected a number of them, which I will put to you as we go along. And the third thing is I have a feeling there's a lot of pent-up demand to hear your views on what the...
Something going on?
The stable genius who resides at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Very safe.
Yeah, so I promised to ask a few questions about that, but first let's start with the film.
Yeah, thank you.
And actually, let's start with the first film. An Inconvenient Truth is an incredibly hard act to follow, and you could have just rested on your laurels as a filmmaker. Why did you decide to take the risk to make a sequel?
Well, I'm not a filmmaker. I don't even play one on TV. Some people may get that impression. But Bonnie and John are the filmmakers, and the filmmaker for the first movie, Davis Guggenheim, did an extraordinary job. And by the way, Jeff Skoll is not here this evening, but he's the founder, as you know, Participant, and has made it possible for a lot of great, meaningful movies to be made that are entertaining as well. And there's someone here who was really responsible for the first movie being a gleam in anybody's eye in the first place, and that's Lori David. I'm told Lori was here. Lori, are you? Raise your hand if you are. She saw one of my slideshows back in 2006, I guess, and she said, "Al, you've got to make that into a movie." And I knew so little about movie making that I actually thought it was a terrible idea. I really did. And I'm so glad they convinced me otherwise. But what was your question again?
Why take the risk?
Why take the risk?
Following up an Oscar-winning triumph.
Well, first, Jeff and Diane and I have been on the receiving end of an enormous number of requests since soon after the first movie finished its run. When are you going to do another one? When are you going to do another one? And for all the reasons you're, presuming in your question, I wasn't eager to do that. But there's this job. I mean, this is all about helping to mobilize people around the world, and that job isn't done yet. We've made a lot of progress, but when we got to the 10-year mark, Jeff and I and Diane, we all thought, well, 10 years is a good anniversary date upon which we can ask the audience for permission to come back and tell you what's new. And there's a lot new. And you just saw it, but the two things mainly, the crisis is worse than was predicted. Just think about the fires in California. Think about the Thomas Fire in Southern California, Northern California earlier this year. Think about the hurricanes that were, biblical in scope, and this is a global phenomenon. That's the first thing that's new. It's worse. It's been happening faster than they predicted. It is an existential threat to the future of human civilization. But the second thing that's new in the last 10 years is incredibly hopeful. We have the solutions now, and they're affordable. And as the mayor of Georgetown, Texas, a conservative, Trump-supporting Republican mayor in the heart of oil country, who happens to be a CPA and is good with arithmetic, and he figured out we can save money, and then the air is cleaner. It's kind of a side benefit that we're helping to save the future of humanity, and that's new. That's new, and the cost of solar and wind and batteries and electric cars and efficiency technologies, they're all coming down so quickly. It's astonishing. I remember being surprised decades ago when somebody first explained to me what Moore's Law is all about, and that computers get half as expensive every couple of years or twice as powerful for the same money. Wow, that's amazing, Bicycles and trucks didn't operate that way, but some forms of technology respond to research and development and scaling, and it's amazing news, heaven sent, that solar and wind and these others respond the same way as computer chips, and it's just but we have to match it with policy. So telling those two new realities, and in the process trying to further get the word out there and mobilize a grassroots force around the world to overcome the lobbying pressure of the fossil fuel polluters, that's what it's all about.
Let me just ask you one more question about the film. You talk in the film about hope and despair. Anybody in your line of work alternates between the two. And just a comparison between the two films. The original film was, I think in the best sense of the word, wonky. It was very cerebral. This film feels so much more emotional. It's very uplifting at the end, but there's real anger, and it feels like regret in it as well. What does that say about your state of mind these days and how that...
Well, I wouldn't use the word regret. You probably saw me struggling to contain the impulse to anger. Anger very rarely does any good, but sometimes, you look at what's going on. I mean, we're using the sky as an open sewer, 110 million more tons every day. How do we look at our kids and grandkids and say, don't worry. Well, we need to stop this. And when you look at the range of consequences, I mean, it's really hard to match up the danger and the threat with the complacency, much less the denial that too many people still engage in. So sometimes, yes, I'm tempted to feel angry about that. But anger's not that's really not a theme. You saw me try to button that up right away, because I think that the hope is legitimate and real, and is a much more powerful source of motivation for people to get busy and solve this. When you can see the path forward, and there's a realistic way to get there and create jobs at the same time. People don't know. Right now, today, the Bureau of Labor Statistics just came out with this a couple months ago. Solar jobs in the U.S. are now growing 17 times faster than the average job growth. It's by far the fastest growing source of employment. Second fastest growing job is wind turbine technician. Mm-hmm. And then there's a drop-off before you get to the third. The world is in the early stages of a sustainability revolution that has the magnitude and scope of the Industrial Revolution, but the speed of the digital revolution. And I truly believe it's unstoppable, but the pace of it is still something we have to choose. The world is subsidizing fossil fuels at the rate of something like $5 trillion a year. It's just ridiculous. And something like 38 times more subsidies for coal, oil, and gas than the meager encouragements for renewable energy. That's nuts, and we need to change that. And I'm optimistic, but we need to pick up the pace.
I want to bring in a question from the audience. This is from Benjamin K. Benjamin, are you here? And the question is, what are you doing to help integrate the messages in your film into schools across America in a meaningful way?
Great question. Thank you. There are lots and lots of schools that are part of the social media and social action plan that Participant and the Climate Reality Project and others are pursuing. And thank you for NRDC's help on all this. And we are reaching out in a very focused way to schools. I've published children's versions of some of the books that I've done. The children's version of this one is not out yet, but we have a real focus on schools, yes.
I want to ask you to be a psychiatrist for a second and help us understand a certain kind of climate denial. You know, you tell the story of the Deep Space Climate Observatory, and, you know, we see the same sort of clampdown on science happening now in the present administration. We saw it during the Bush years. But, you know, on some level, somebody making a decision at senior government level to refuse to put into orbit instruments that will help. Okay. I mean, on some level, that must mean that they believe climate change is real. Otherwise, you know, if it's all magical nonsense, what's the difference? Yeah. So on some level they must believe it, and yet they clamp down anyway. And I mean, the question is, you could frame it a number of different ways, but they have kids, they have grandkids. Don't they worry about them? Really, I really am curious, because you've met so many of these people. What is going on in their heads?
Well, over 100 years ago, first of all, I don't fully understand it, but I've spent a lot of time trying to. More than 100 years ago, one of the muckraker reporters, Upton Sinclair, wrote a famous line. He said, "It's difficult to get a man to understand something if his paycheck depends upon him not understanding it." And if you substitute campaign contributions or jobs after retiring from Congress or lobbying, whatever, I think that is a part of it. But the climate denial campaign is much larger and more focused and more insidious than that. There's an old saying in Tennessee. I flew Southwest Airlines this afternoon from Nashville to here. There's an old saying in Tennessee that if you see a turtle on top of a fence post, you can be pretty sure it didn't get there by itself. And when you see in the United States, uniquely among all the nations of the world, these persistently high levels of climate denial, you can be pretty sure that didn't happen by itself. They've spent hundreds of millions of dollars, the Koch brothers, Exxon Mobil, there's a list of them, Murray, Cole, and ideological allies that want to, in the words of one of them, shrink the government to the size where it can be drowned in the bathtub. And they have blood in their eye for anything related to climate. Some of them on the ideological side are so anti-statist, and I get that. You know, we've had problems with overbearing government stuff. I get it, but you know, up to a point. And they fear that a true and meaningful response to the climate crisis would probably be accompanied by an increase in the activity of government in various levels, and specifically requirements of less pollution, and they're particular corporations that really are threatened by that, and they've mobilized. And they took the playbook from the tobacco industry. Many people are familiar with this story. It's been documented thoroughly. The tobacco industry decades ago, when the doctors and scientists warned everybody that smoking cigarettes causes lung cancer and other diseases, the tobacco companies had a lavishly financed campaign. They hired actors and dressed them up as doctors and put them in front of cameras to falsely reassure people that there were no health problems whatsoever. And it went on for decades. The old ads are still available on Google. They hired the same PR people, some of them. And so that's a big part of this denial. I think there are a couple of other elements worth mentioning. First of all of us as human beings are vulnerable to the garden variety denial, meaning if something is uncomfortable to think about, the natural tendency is to sometimes just push it away. And if you're in the presence of somebody that's going to fly into a rage if you bring up global warming, then a lot of people say it's just not worth it. You know, it's like a dysfunctional family with an alcoholic father who flies into a rage if alcohol is mentioned, so the rest of the family just kind of tiptoes around the subject and never talks about it. And that's a part of it. And then finally, in my knowledge, the scientists have a geeky term called system justification principle, and forgive me, there's probably a better way to label it, but basically what they're saying is we all have a human need to believe that things are basically okay, and the large systems within which we live our lives are basically okay. If they weren't, you know, that's a formula for anxiety. And if somebody comes in with his hair on fire saying everything's got to change, then, you know, calm down, fella, calm down. And I think there's a little bit of that going on also. But the main part of it, I'm convinced, is this determined advertising campaign, the propagandistic use of pseudoscientists to intentionally confuse people.
Yeah. So the next question essentially is, so what do we do about it? But let me preface it with this. There was a recent poll that found that nearly half of registered Republicans believe climate change is due mostly to, quote, natural changes in the environment. And in the coverage of this, there was a professor of sociology quoted saying, being skeptical about global warming has become part of the Republican or conservative identity. Mm-hmm. So I guess the question is, how did that come to pass, and what are we going to do about it? How are we going to reach these people? We really have to get across this divide somehow.
Yeah.
How do we communicate to them?
Yeah, and some people call it tribal politics. You use the word identity. I think it's true. It's kind of a badging exercise. If you know, it's if somebody wants to be a part of that political identity, they feel a tremendous amount of pressure to be against restricting gun ownership or use for whatever, and other issues like it, and they feel pressure to say global warming is natural. It's not real. And it's kind of dangerous if we allow these tribal and partisan identities to reach a level of vehemence that to the point where our common resource of shared facts that we discuss and come to a collective understanding are more likely to be true than not. If we lose that, then the basis of self-governance is lost along with it. And I'm going to take you on a brief excursion to philosophy. Forgive me, but there was a school of philosophers in Germany called the Frankfurt School, and after World War II, they went back to Germany to try to do a kind of a moral autopsy on the Third Reich. What in the hell was that? Whoa, what happened? And one of them, a man named Theodor Adorno, wrote a sentence that really captured my attention. He identified what he thought was the first step on the descent into hell, in Germany in the 30s. And he said it was this: all questions of truth became questions of power. And the conversion of questions of fact to questions of power attacked the very distinction between what is true and what is false. And I'm not going so far as to draw too tight an analogy between, what happened there and what's happening here. I know better than to do that. It was a unique and uniquely evil phenomenon. But the authoritarian tendencies that are now so manifest, not just in our country, but in a whole bunch of countries around the world. Truth, as determined by the masses of the literate who converse freely and test each other's ideas, they don't like that. They don't like that because that can be an impediment to the raw use of power to acquire more power or more wealth, which they can use to acquire more power. And so I think that this really belligerent approach to science and facts, and even universities, some of them, will say it's snobbish to recommend that people go to college, and they'll call universities liberal propaganda institutions. Well, education's a good thing, and I mean, it sounds silly to even reaffirm that, but that's connected to this fierce refusal to accept the facts.
Yeah. Let's get back to this line you used a moment ago. You said we're in the early stages of a global sustainability revolution, the magnitude of the industrial revolution, the speed. Yeah. I mean, yes, it seems that is true. Is it happening really as fast as it needs to be? And maybe more important, more interesting, can you give us a glimpse of what that is going to bring 10 or 20 years from now? What is our world going to look like because of that revolution?
Well, a lot of business managers are now acquiring the ability to manage electrons and atoms and molecules with the same precision that we've come to expect in the management of bits of information. And the sustainability revolution is empowered in part by the new digital tools, including the Internet of Things and machine learning, artificial intelligence. It has its counterparts on the biology and genomic side. The sequencing of genomes is reducing in costs 8 times faster than Moore's Law. It's incredible. First genome was sequenced for $3 billion. It's now down to a little over $100 at cost. And before too long, you'll be able to go down to the drugstore for $10 and sequence your whole genome. Not that you necessarily want to do that, but my point is that we are acquiring an ability to be much more precise. And there's so much waste in materials and energy, heat, electricity, and the advantages available to us are so great that businesses and others are moving very, very fast in that direction. India did a complete about-face after the Paris Agreement. They have 175 gigawatts of solar under construction now. They've shut 37 coal mines this year. They've shut down a bunch of coal-burning plants. They're still putting a lot of pollution out there, but my point is they're moving in the right direction. And very few people saw this news story when it came out a few months ago, but India's announced that within only 12 years, 100% of all their new cars and trucks will have to be electric vehicles. They're moving faster than we are in the United States. And what will the world look like? Well, it'll be a mix, but you'll see much higher levels of efficiency. We've essentially decoupled greenhouse gas pollution from economic sustainable growth. we have an opportunity to create a lot of employment. I referred to that earlier. But is it, you started by asking, is it happening fast enough? No, it's not. But a great economist, now deceased, Rudy Dornbush, once wrote, "Things take longer to happen than you think they will, but then they happen much faster than you thought they could." And we've all seen that at times in our own lives, and that's happening with this sustainability revolution. And I truly believe that it may end up happening much faster than we thought it could.
So given that speed and given what we're seeing in the great city of Santa Monica and the great state of California, why does it matter that the Trump administration is walking us away from Paris?
Well, first of all, some people know this, some don't. The first date upon which the U.S. can legally withdraw from the Paris Agreement happens to be the first day after the next presidential election in 2020. And by the way, if there is a new president, excuse me for a moment. If there is a new president could simply give 30 days notice and the U.S. would be back in the agreement. And the rest of the world didn't just ignore Donald Trump's speech withdrawing. They took it as a challenge, many of them, and doubled down. And what Santa Monica's done, what hundreds of cities have done, what California has done. Jerry Brown is a real hero in my book where climate is concerned, among other things. But also the state of New York, state of Washington, Oregon, a whole bunch of others, and thousands of businesses. So you could reach the conclusion that it doesn't matter that much that he made that speech. However, here's the bedrock reality in all this. When I first started working on this 40 years ago, what was true then is still true today. The maximum that is politically feasible still falls short of the minimum that is necessary to satisfy the laws of physics and stop this destruction of the ecological conditions that gave rise to the flourishing of humanity and human civilization, and can bring it down if they're not protected. But when faced with that conundrum, you got two options. One is to curl up in a fetal position and fall into despair, which doesn't do much good. And the second option is to expand the limits of what's politically possible. Now, the Paris Agreement was a truly historic breakthrough, and it expanded the limits of what's politically possible significantly, but still not by enough to really solve the crisis. Now, it built in a 5-year review every 5 years, and we'll start next year on the first review period, and I'm optimistic about that. But if instead of a president who was, digging his heels in and kicking and screaming and appointing climate deniers, if instead we had a president who was actively trying to lead the world community and lead our own country in the right direction, we could make faster progress in expanding the limits of the politically possible until they begin to overlap what really works. And, some of this, I'll finish with this. I know I'm taking too long, but 110 million tons a day, as I mentioned, some of it will be there for thousands of years. But here's a little known fact. If we could magically stop tomorrow, no more man-made CO2 and greenhouse gases going up there, how long would it take for 50% of it to fall out? Answer, 20, 30 years. Now, we can't do that. We really can't. But it gives a sense of what we could approach if it really did start happening much faster than anybody imagined it could. We have the ability to affect the pace of the ice melt, of the degradation of the atmosphere, all the other consequences. We still have the ability to forestall the truly catastrophic changes, but we need to get busy doing it, and we could do that much more easily with a president who was willing to lead. We're only 1 year into this experiment and you know that in science and medicine, some experiments are terminated early for ethical reasons. Just saying.
I'm sure many people here read in November an article in the New Yorker by Elizabeth Colbert about carbon removal. And what she says in this piece, essentially, is that almost all of the climate models that will succeed in holding warming to under 2 degrees Celsius depend not only on getting our emissions down to zero very rapidly, but on actually removing from the atmosphere large amounts of carbon already emitted. And yet the technology to do that doesn't exist. Is she right in that characterization? And what are the prospects for industrial and agricultural carbon removal?
Yeah. Well, yes, she is right, with one modification that she would agree to, and I think it's in the article. We know how to capture CO2 emissions from a power plant and compress them and put them in the ground and store them safely. Yeah. We know all of that works. We know how to do it. It's just so expensive that none of the power plants will do it. If you're the CEO of an electric generating company and you decide we're going to capture all our CO2 and put it in the ground, you got to find a repository. But the main thing is you're going to have to take 1/3 of the electricity you're now selling to customers and use it to run this process, and they can't survive that. So if there is some kind of technological breakthrough that makes it easier to capture the CO2, then maybe that'll become feasible. I hope so. The best way to encourage it would be to put a price on carbon so that the economy starts recognizing the economic realities of the choices we make. Now, beyond that, the idea of scavenging CO2 in the free air, that's tougher still, and we don't know how to do that. Along with Jim Hansen and Tim Flannery and some others, I am a member of a small jury to award a ton of money put up by Richard Branson for anybody that comes up with a technology to do that. And we review the submissions every year, and nobody's come close to claiming the money yet. But maybe we can do it. They have something called BECS, and I can't remember the acronym, but basically what it means is growing a lot of plants and trees and then burying them and sequestering, taking carbon out. I mean, the best technology we have for removing carbon from the air is called a tree. And if you take it to scale, it's called a forest. And we can do a lot more of that. Now, the soil, you mentioned agriculture. There's about 3.5 times as much carbon in the topsoils of the world as in all the trees and plants put together. And modern agriculture too frequently strip mines that soil carbon out. And there are better farming techniques that actually put much more carbon in the soil, and we need to do that.
No-till farming.
No-till is part of it, sparing the overuse of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. There's a whole lot that I was on my farm in Tennessee day before yesterday, and we're really actively involved in that on a small scale there. I'm learning a lot about it. It's a lot of fun.
So let's talk about adaptation. I mean, implicit in so much of what you said is that a certain amount of warming is baked in. There's nothing we can do about it. So what should we be doing now to adapt to the changes that are inevitable already?
Years ago, I'm embarrassed that I had this position because I see it as clearly wrong now. But I used to think, let's don't even talk about adaptation because that'll give some people the false impression that we don't need to stop using the sky as an open sewer. We can just adapt to it, and it'll take energy away from what we need to stop destroying the ecological system. But we have a moral obligation to proceed simultaneously with efforts at adaptation and efforts at mitigation or stopping the destruction. And what do we need to do? Oh, God, it's a long list. And you can start with coastal communities. You know, the East Coast is really more vulnerable than the West Coast, particularly the mid-Atlantic states. And, of course, Miami is the most threatened city in the world by assets at risk, and you saw some images from Miami. Norfolk, the largest naval base in the world, is going to have to be completely moved. Annapolis, you can go right down the list. Galveston, Texas, and that's just in this country. You know, Mumbai, Calcutta, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Ho Chi Minh City, West Africa.
But does this mean that we should start moving our cities now?
Yes. Well, let me hold on. We will have to manage an orderly retreat from some low-lying coastal areas, and then more. We will have to pay attention to property insurance in floodplains, building codes in areas that we know are going to have to be evacuated. We don't actually, the scientists are not able yet to tell us how quickly the sea level will rise. But all the evidence has made it seem faster rather than slower over the last couple of decades. But that's only part of it. California and much of the West has been freshly reminded of what the scientists have long warned about: fires and global warming. You know, don't need to tell you all, but humidity got down to like 1%. Temperature goes up, and it's directly correlated with the incidence of fire. You get the right conditions, a reflection off a Coke can apparently can start a damn fire, or maybe a transformer line comes down. And that is projected to be much worse. And so adaptation has implications for fire-prone areas as well. What's planted, how it's maintained. We need public health measures to adapt, because these tropical diseases and the vectors like mosquitoes and ticks and the rest, we can protect people much more effectively if we plus up on the public health side. There's a long list of adaptation. It's very involved. It costs money, and as with all of these things, it's much better to prevent it in the first place. But we're now down the road to the point where we have to do both.
Here's another audience question. It's from Ruby Dembo. I hope you're here, Ruby. It's pithy. I am 10. What about my future?
Oh, bless. Where is? She's what?
In bed.
She's in bed. Okay. Well, so many of us have gained the biggest part of our passion and motivation to work on this from thinking about our kids and grandchildren. And that doesn't work for everybody, evidently, but we really, I didn't intend that to be a laugh line. I'm just stating the facts as I know them. But what about her world? I address this in the movie. We need to be able to tell that 10-year-old that we care about her, and that we care about the circumstances in which she grows up and becomes an adult herself and raises her own family, if God willing she wants to do that. And I don't know how else to say it. I mean, do we care or do we not? Who are we? Are we destined to destroy ourselves? I refuse to believe that. I mean, we have limitations as primates with opposable thumbs and a neocortex, and behavioral legacies that put us at risk, but we also have the ability to transcend those limitations, and we've seen it in times past. We know we can do this.
So let's talk for a second about our stable genius. There's footage in the film of you going to Trump Tower.
Yeah.
And if I understand correctly, you sat down with President Trump or spoke to him once or twice after that, trying to convince him not to pull out of Paris. What was it like to talk about climate change with him? Could he sit still? I mean, could you have any insight at all into what he actually thinks?
Well, I have, I was vice president for 8 years, and I followed a rule of keeping my conversations with the president confidential, and rightly or wrongly, it's just I have come to feel that that's a good rule for me to follow. So I have protected the privacy of that conversation. I will tell you that I had reason to believe that he might well change his mind, as he had stated it in the campaign, but he did not. And I have no further hope or illusion that he's going to change his mind on climate. I just don't. I hope I'm wrong. Maybe somebody else can convince him, but I'm quite confident that I cannot. Look, the next few months are going to be really challenging for our country. I think people feel this coming, and I don't know how long this period of turbulence is going to keep going on, but it's going to be a real test for us as a country. We're more divided now than back when Nixon was removed from office. There wasn't any Fox News back then, or Rush Limbaugh. That's not a cheap shot at them. You can take it that way if you want. I don't really care, but I'm trying to make a serious point. The situation is very different now. I do think I'll tell you a quick story about my experience as a young reporter. After I went to the Army and came back from overseas and went to work as a journalist, and I worked for a newspaper editor named John Sigenthaler, who was one of the first investigative journalists. This was before Woodward and Bernstein made the label one that had some cachet. And I went to work for him, and he taught me, the techniques and so forth. And then he sent me to a school for investigative reporters in December of 1972. And there were about 25 of us from around the country, and we all thought we were real hot shots. And we had followed very closely the work being done by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who were about our age at that time. And the Watergate break-in was June 17th of 72, and by December, they had connected enough dots that close readers, as we were, said, holy moly, this is being run out of the White House, pretty clear. But November, just 1 month before, Nixon had won the largest electoral landslide in history. I think it's still the largest. And so we were depressed at the possibility that maybe investigative reporting didn't matter anymore. And in the age of television, people wouldn't follow these complex narratives crammed full of facts. And I went back to Tennessee thinking, wow, maybe this is a wrong profession for me. But a few months after that, all hell broke loose. And soon Nixon was out of office. Now, here's what I think I learned from that experience. I may be wrong, but here's what I think I learned. When you have a very professional, well-organized, buttoned-up investigation by serious professionals, that investigation has a rhythm all its own, and it proceeds well underneath the news cycle. And you only see evidence of it when they decide that they need to surface some guilty plea or some indictment. But I think it's safe to say that what we've read about in the news coverage is a very tiny fraction of what Robert Mueller and his team have compiled. I have no inside knowledge of it. I really don't. But I think that it would be a mistake to think that this, just because you don't see them in the news every day, that it's not a big deal. It's a very, very big deal. And I don't know what the timing is, but I think that the next several months are likely to be real challenging for us.
I got a signal, which I'm not sure if it meant time's up or one more question. Time's up.
One more. Let's do one more question.
One more question. So let's. Yeah. I hope it's a hopeful question. Your 2018 is a momentous year politically, and so far things are looking pretty good. We're seeing good signs so far. What do you think is going to happen, and what would it mean for the environmental agenda if Democrats are able to take back the House and the Senate?
Well, I think it would mean a lot. Right now, if you are a Democrat and you're looking at the possibility of success next November, you would come to the conclusion, as you've just stated, a lot of things can change. It's still early. But when there is a so-called wave election, you can sometimes feel it coming well in advance. And there are a whole lot of people who feel like that's what this year is probably going to be about. But I can just say I hope so. And I say that not just because I've always been in the Democratic Party, but because the country's in really serious danger right now. The Senate's a much tougher challenge for Democrats. 1/3 of the Senate comes up every 2 years, but the Democrats have to defend 25 seats this cycle, and the Republicans only have to defend 9 seats. So it's a tough challenge, not impossible at all. You look at what happened in Alabama, and of course unique circumstances there, but also in Virginia and New Jersey. I'd say one of my favorite outcomes was the older member of the state legislature, House delegates in Virginia, who had been the author of the so-called bathroom bill, was defeated by a transgender woman.
Yes.
And I just thought, you go, girl.
Yeah. Okay, well, I wanted to thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for coming.
And if everybody
Thank you, Bonnie and John.
Thank you, Frank. Yeah. And if everybody could remain in their seats while Mr. Gore leaves.